We know for a fact that the numbers of majority-minority districts decreased from the first version of the state maps to the second version of the state maps, despite the fact that there is, for instance, increasing numbers of Latinos living in the state of Illinois. Those people deserve a chance to be heard and to be rightfully represented, as we all do. And the Democratic supermajority in the state of Illinois chose to disrespect them.
So I believe that the congressional map does more fairly represent the state in terms of diversity. The legislative map does have some challenges, and I believe that they could have easily made an additional Latino district, especially on the southwest side of Chicago.
Welcome to the CloutCast. I'm Joel Ebert. I'll be your host this week. For months, Illinois lawmakers have undertaken the once-a-decade task of drawing new political boundaries for the legislature, state Supreme Court, and congressional districts. The process has been lengthy and at times messy, with everyday citizens voicing their concerns about lack of transparency, adequate information, and the at times rushed nature of the proceedings. On our first episode of the CloutCast, the Daily Line offered a perspective look at the legislative redistricting process as well as the redrawing of boundaries in Chicago. The city is just weeks away from a required deadline for passing new ward boundaries. The legislative maps, meanwhile, are facing a legal challenge that is expected to wrap up before 2022. The recently approved congressional boundaries are still being analyzed, with candidates still deciding what they want to do next year. This week on the CloutCast, I'll look back on the past 11 months of redistricting in the Illinois legislature by talking to Madeleine Doubek, the executive director of Change Illinois. You'll also hear from mapmaker Frank Calabrese, who testified in several legislative hearings while working for Chicago Democrats. Both Dubeck and Calabrese share their impressions of the redistricting process and what was approved, while offering a look ahead at how redistricting could change in the future. Let's get started. Joining me now on the CloutCast is Madeleine Doubek, Executive Director of Change Illinois. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Joel.
So the last time I talked to you on the CloutCast was almost a year ago for our first episode, which sort of served as a setup for redistricting in the state legislature and the Chicago City Council. So I wanted to check back in with you now that a lot has been done in the state level. Lawmakers have held dozens of hearings and ultimately approved new district boundaries for the legislature, the state Supreme Court, and most recently, the congressional boundaries. Throughout the redistricting process, several organizations, including yours, were engaged speaking at public hearings. But for those that didn't hear the hours of testimony, which unfortunately I had to listen to every single one of them, what were some of the high points of Change's testimony during those hearings?
Well, I guess, first of all, we should point out that lawmakers, in fact, approved two versions of state legislative maps, because the first set of maps they drew were based on averaged community survey data, not actual 2020 census data. And in fact, it turned out that once we had the census data in mid-August, everybody realized what we had predicted all along, which is that the districts were very much out of equal population. So there was a situation where several districts had far more people than others or far fewer people than others. And so that's a clear violation outside of a range of 10% of the principle of one person, one vote. So lawmakers had to come back and do it all over again. And they rushed through the process a second time. And in fact, in the end, further alienated Black and brown voters in the state of Illinois and created fewer opportunities for them to elect people of their choosing.
And throughout those hearings, you guys were essentially asking lawmakers slow down, right?
We were asking them to slow down, to please truly engage more people in more communities across the state of Illinois. There was some attempt to reach groups like ours, but not any, what I would say, vigorous attempts to advertise what was going on and truly engage lots of regular people around the state. They like to say that they had record numbers of hearings, but very few people actually were aware of those hearings and participated in them. And most of the hearings were held during most people's working hours. So it was really not a transparent process, not an open process, not a process centered on what the people of the state of Illinois want. And in fact, I would say it felt like talking to a brick wall.
It also seemed, when you're coming to these hearings and have no idea what to react to, right? Maps weren't introduced until what one might say is the very end of the process, leaving the public very little time to offer a reaction. Probably the most reaction came with the congressional redistricting maps, which some would say led to some of those changes. But there was very I guess I would say limited interaction between having a new map, the public being able to see it and provide an adequate, criticism that lawmakers could incorporate. Was that your sort of assessment as well?
Absolutely. In some cases, there was literally less than an hour between when a revised map was publicized and a hearing was held, and then a few hours later, votes were held. So it's practically impossible for people to look at a map, digest it, understand the composition of various districts, and be able to engage and react and respond in a meaningful way when that's the situation.
Looking back on the hearings and then the maps that were ultimately produced and approved, what were your impressions on whether the voices of community members, whether it was in the legislative redistricting process where you heard folks like, the Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition arguing that they didn't have any representation, and others like Latino groups saying, we need equal representation. Were those voices and the concerns that they had heeded by what came out of the maps?
No, absolutely not. The Dr. Delara Saeed from the Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition very passionately and eloquently pointed out that she and others were speaking time and time again at every single hearing, and yet they were perhaps heard but not truly listened to. No one reflected their needs and wants. They feel like they got no representation out of these maps whatsoever. And in the case of Latino groups, again, there were major opportunities missed to provide a growing population in the state more representation. And so as a result, we have the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, among a few other groups, suing and claiming that their constitutional rights and their right to representation have been violated.
One of the stock responses from Democrats throughout this process is that they were trying to draft maps that were reflective of the state in terms of demographics. What did you make of that line? And was it a sort of loaded rhetoric that gives the majority sort of a cover to ultimately boost their control?
I think that's a great way to put it, Joel. I think that line of rhetoric is just that. It's rhetoric. It's a patent falsehood, and the facts indicate otherwise. So, it's saying something that's going to sound good in a press release or as a defense in a lawsuit. But we know for a fact that the numbers of majority minority districts decreased from the first version of the state maps to the second version of the state maps, despite the fact that there is, for instance, increasing numbers of Latinos living in the state of Illinois. And those people deserve a chance to be heard and to be rightfully represented, as we all do. And the Democratic supermajority in the state of Illinois chose to disrespect them.
What did you make of the actions of Republicans during the redistricting process? They didn't submit any maps, and they largely just sort of used a lot of these hearings as opportunities to sort of point out the shortcomings of the majority, or what they argued were, and potentially, just make the case for why this process should be taken out of lawmakers' hands. What were your thoughts on the GOP?
Well, they have also filed suit claiming that various groups in the state had their rights trampled upon, and we will see what comes of that in the next month or so. Hopefully, we'll have a resolution before the end of the year, when it's time for candidates to start going around collecting signatures to try to run from these districts. There was a lot of pushback from Democrats that Republicans should have offered up their own maps. The Republicans replied saying, we don't believe that we should be creating maps. We believe residents should be creating them, or an independent redistricting commission should be creating them. That flies in the face of what's happening in other states where Republicans are in the majority. So it's hard for me to assess whether their comments were genuine or not.
What do you think the effects could be after the new legislative and congressional maps, become enacted? Obviously, after the courts handle the legislative maps, but what do you think the ultimate effect could be?
I think clearly it will be an increase in Democratic numbers in the state of Illinois, and they already have a supermajority. Now, typically at the congressional level, in an off-year election, which is what we will have next year, the party out of power in the White House tends to do better, and we just saw that happen, in fact, in Virginia, and close call in New Jersey. So perhaps the congressional map won't produce quite as many Democratic seats as had been predicted. We'll have to wait and see, but certainly I think the party in power, whichever party it is, went for broke, and in this case it was Democrats in Illinois, and tried to produce maps that are going to produce as many Democrats as possible so that they can keep their grip on power and grow it whenever possible.
We've already alluded to the court challenge to the legislative maps, but I don't know how close you're paying attention to the proceedings in that. But as that 3-judge panel considers the cases, which have been consolidated, what are you going to be looking for?
Well, I very much was heartened to see that the 3-judge panel declared the first set of maps to be unconstitutional, and in fact made a point of noting in their opinion that there were a lot of complaints from Change Illinois and other groups that this process was far from transparent, open, and meaningful for the people of Illinois. And so I take that as a good sign, and I'm very eager to see if, in fact, they believe, as we do, that these maps need to be revised.
The last time we spoke for this podcast, you talked about how previous efforts to change the way Illinois redistricting have been stymied for various reasons, including the legal challenge to add a question on the ballot and the COVID-19 pandemic. The question, I guess, now with this process largely behind, what's next, for groups like yours? Is there room or a willingness to make another push to remove lawmakers from the redistricting process, or what are you focusing on in, the coming months and years, really?
Well, we're not giving up and going away. Sorry to have to say that out loud for lawmakers. We're going to continue to pester them and be as big a thorn in their collective side as we can be. The people of the state have demonstrated in supermajority numbers in scientific polls over and over and over again that they want politicians taken out of the redistricting process. They want a much more nonpartisan even-handed approach that truly serves the people of Illinois. And so we're assessing a number of options. Certainly, I hope that attempts at the federal level to try to mandate that congressional redistricting be done by independent commissions nationwide eventually succeeds. Certainly, I would hope that there might be some appetite in Springfield for removing this provision that has not worked well at all in our state constitution, that threatens drawing names from a hat in order to determine which political party gains control over the redistricting process. We're going to try everything we can think of to try to persuade our lawmakers that they have an inherent conflict of interest when they're picking their voters instead of voters picking them. And so we'll continue to fight that battle and wage that war.
Could that potentially include another effort to get a question on the ballot, or is that that bridge is passed?
I don't know whether that bridge is passed, to be perfectly honest, Joel. I think that is going to depend on the outcome of the next Supreme Court elections and how that Supreme Court is shaped. I don't think if the makeup of the Supreme Court changes, that we have a very good chance of succeeding in that effort. We probably would continue to try to take more of a legislative approach to fixing the problem, but we have to wait and see what happens with those elections and how this all shakes out in the next year or two. But we'll be organizing and trying to engage more people in Illinois to understand that, when politicians are picking their voters, they're essentially determining the outcome of the election before you cast your ballot, and that's voter suppression. And, ironically enough, it's the Democratic Party that has been trying to fight voter suppression efforts across the country. And so that ought to apply here as well.
There's so many ironies, I think, in this Illinois process, including the fact that you had, major players involved in this process who are either African-American or Latino, but leading to a reduction in the number of districts that would be Latino or Black influence or majority districts. Why do you think that is?
The only thing that I can think of is simply that the leadership of the party made it very clear that they were going to do what they were going to do, and everybody better fall in step and go along, or their campaign help was going to be withheld from them. The financial help that they get from their leaders was going to be withheld from them. At the congressional level, the outcome of the districts is very much a high priority at the national level because there's such a slim majority in the House for the Democratic Party. And so I think the marching orders were to get in line and follow the leaders, or risk retaliation is the only thing I can conclude. No one has told me that. That's totally my speculation. But it's baffling to me that certain members of the Black Caucus and the Latino Caucus did not fight more for more districts that would help their constituents have more political power and better representation. It was odd to me to see State Senator Christina Castro very vocally asking people during congressional hearings if they believed there ought to be a second Latino influence district in the congressional maps. And there was nothing like that on the part of any Latino or Black lawmakers during any of the state hearings.
The process and the sort of way that they drew the districts even on the congressional level seemed to be very different than what they did in the legislative districts in terms of following certain boundaries and splitting up cities. But that's a whole nother thing we can get into at another point. So the last question I had for you is, you're seeing other states go through their redistricting processes right now. And several of them, for the first time, have implemented sort of these non-legislative or lawmaker-led systems, right? You've seen one in Michigan and a couple of other states. Are you optimistic that as there are other states that begin to adopt this, that might add additional pressure on Illinois lawmakers to change the way they do this in 2031?
I certainly hope so. Colorado is another state that is having an independent commission draw maps for the first time. As you noted, Michigan is another. Ohio tried to do things a little bit differently than most other states, and there have been plenty of bumps along the road in several of these instances. They haven't always worked out perfectly, but I do think that there is momentum building and growing across the country, in support of ending politician involvement in drawing their own districts and picking their own voters. And I think that's only going to grow.
Madeleine Doubek with Change Illinois, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Joel. Thanks for having me.
Joining me now on the CloutCast is Frank Calabrese, a map maker who is working on legislative and has worked on congressional redistricting as well as some city stuff for the city of Chicago. Thanks for coming on, Frank.
Thanks for having me, Joel.
So, Frank, I wanted to get back with you to reflect on sort of what's been going on the legislative end of things. You've testified throughout the redistricting process, including during the congressional redistricting. And when you spoke before House and Senate committees, you encouraged lawmakers to create a second Latino influence district. For listeners who didn't hear you, explain why you were advocating for that.
Sure. So currently I work for the Chicago Latino Caucus, making the maps for the city of Chicago. And a priority has also been increasing the Latino representation at the congressional level. So right now, Illinois is about 18% Latino, but we only have 1 out of 18 Latino congressional districts. And the Latino population in Cook County is kind of divided into north and south. On the southwest side, you have a very heavy Mexican-American population. The northwest side, it's a little more mixed with like Puerto Rican, Guatemalan, more Central American. And so you have like two very distinct Latino communities, and they're not geographically connected. The current congressional district is actually connected by 290 and some cemeteries in Forest Park. So you have two distinct Latino communities, two very large Latino communities, and you can certainly create two separate Latino districts, and that's what the state legislature eventually did.
It looked like at the beginning when you presented your first presentation on this, and then they came out with their first version of maps, that they weren't going to listen to your recommendation. But then eventually the maps that were adopted did incorporate both of those, Latino influenced districts. Do you know what changed?
I think that we did a very good job of getting the conversation out there. We were covered, in various media outlets, and a lot of people in Springfield were talking about it. The first map, it was drawn to have Marie Newman run against Adam Kinzinger. Now that, I think Springfield thought that would be beneficial to Marie Newman, considering the alternative of turning her district into a Latino district. But she did not like her district running against Adam Kinzinger. And so I believe Springfield Democrats just said, well, if you don't like this, we're just going to make a Latino district that's going to satisfy, our Latino partners in the legislature.
You said you were working for the Latino caucus at the city council. Is there anybody in particular who's been urging that? And is there anybody that might run for that now open congressional seat?
Well, Alderman Gil Villegas, who is the chairman of the Latino caucus, he has announced that he is running for that seat. It was in the Sun-Times today. So he's announced that he's running. And I'm pretty sure there'll be many more people that will announce shortly.
Overall, Democrats argued the new congressional maps, as well as the legislative boundaries, will reflect the state's diversity. In your view, how does that claim square with sort of the legal challenges that have been undergone with the legislative maps, where you have, various groups arguing that the votes of Black and Latinos were diluted under the latest legislative map?
So I believe that the congressional map does more fairly represent the state in terms of diversity. The legislative map does have some challenges. In East St. Louis, the Black population was split up between two legislative seats instead of just having it in one. And the 114th district, which is Representative Greenwood's district, is under 40% Black. Where if you're familiar with East St. Louis in that area, you could easily, in my opinion, make a majority Black district, or certainly greater than 40%. And then in this around the city of Chicago, it seems that Latino representation wasn't really maximized. There's some legal terms of cracking and packing, and basically, what they're alleging, what MALDEF and the Republican Party is alleging, is that they did not efficiently make Latino districts, and I believe that they could have easily made an additional Latino district, especially on the southwest side of Chicago. So, whereas I think the state legislature, I think Springfield Democrats kind of listened to the criticism in their maps, what they made for the state legislature, and they made a congressional map, which you create an additional Latino district, and they're not going to get sued, at least by MALDEF, over the congressional districts.
State lawmakers this year punted on taking up any new maps for judicial subcircuits. I know you testified about that during one of the hearings, specifically about Cook County. Again, for people that don't really know what judicial subcircuits are and why they need to be redistricted, can you explain?
Sure. So this is actually a project I've been working on for a few years. The legislature, they passed a special law 2 years ago to redistrict the judicial subcircuits of Cook County. And what they did during veto session this year is they changed the law they previously passed, and they said they're going to redistrict those subcircuits next year. From my understanding, there was a serious disagreement between what the House wanted to do and what the Senate wanted to do in terms of redoing these districts. So these districts were drawn in 1990, and they reflected the demographics and they reflected the political alliances of the 80s. And obviously, Cook County of today is very different than the Cook County of the 80s. I work in politics, and I work in a lot of these judicial races, and a lot of these, if you could see a picture of what these subcircuits look like, they're just crazy. A lot of people criticize, how some wards look like, but these subcircuits are much worse. And also the subcircuits, because they were created so long ago, they haven't taken into the account the demographic shifts. For example, the West Loop, used to be an African American area. It's essentially white now. West Town used to be a Latino area. It's essentially all white now. And so you had a subcircuit which was designed to elect Latinos. The sixth subcircuit, it doesn't elect Latinos anymore. So out of 15 subcircuits, you only had one subcircuit that could elect Latinos, and that turned out to be a problem. So I'm a little disappointed that the subcircuits weren't redistricted this year, but they will be next year, and I look forward to that happening.
I wanted to turn to sort of looking ahead now. So in previous years, you've heard people argue, community groups and others argue why lawmakers should remove themselves from the remapping process, saying that essentially right now they choose voters rather than the voters choosing them. The arguments in favor of that system of changing the system is essentially saying that right now the process leads to a lot of gerrymandered districts and few competitive races. I wondered what your thoughts are on that, and where you at on whether to keep the current system or to sort of change things in Illinois.
So I believe that more citizen input would be very beneficial. I follow redistricting nationwide, and Illinois probably has one of the less transparent processes. A redistricting commission probably wouldn't be great for Illinois for congressional. That's because many Republican controlled states, they like to pass very extreme gerrymandered congressional districts, such as North Carolina and Florida and Texas. And Illinois is kind of looked at a way to counter, a lot of Republican gerrymandering. But I do believe when it comes to the state legislative level that a more fair, transparent, and citizen-focused process should be implemented. I don't believe this is going to take much power away from Springfield Democrats. I think, I'm a Democrat, but personally, I don't care if, the state house is controlled 70 or 75% by Democrats. I think that if you had a more fair, transparent, and a process that respected kind of community interests and community boundaries better, that Democrats might lose 3 or 4 seats. It would not tip the control to Republicans.
The Democrats that were leading a lot of the legislative hearings were saying, look, we have a lot of hearings. This is giving people the chance to weigh in. But, there weren't that many people that could, obviously because of either the difficulty of, signing in, providing testimony, not seeing maps until the very end. How could, in your mind, could you sort of make this a little bit more transparent, open, aside from just holding a ton of meetings?
So what a lot of other states do is that in a lot of Democratic-controlled states, they have, actual independent redistricting committees. Now, some of them are binding and some are non-binding. I think it would be a good idea to have an advisory, independent, redistricting commission. It doesn't have to be binding. There's many states where it's just advisory, and then the state legislature they amend it as they could. But I think it would be helpful to kind of have some experts that are looking at how to redistrict Illinois, just not through a partisan lens, but more of a community-focused lens, and kind of get those drafts out there, and then let the politics happen afterwards.
How does the state legislative process compare to the city council remapping? Do you see similarities, major differences in terms of openness, transparency?
Well, I believe the state is actually much more transparent than the city. So the city, it's extremely aldermanic focused, right? So we are 3 weeks before the deadline, and the city just launched kind of a public portal. I'm not a big fan of this public portal. It's the same public portal that the state used, and I do this currently for a living, and I had trouble using the portal. It's kind of it's very clumsy. I use different software. So the state, they had live testimony. You could do Zoom. You could submit your maps, and they had that for many months. Where the city is going to do that for probably a 2-week period, and you cannot present testimony via Zoom. You can only have 3 minutes to talk on the phone, and at 3 minutes they literally cut you off. I about half the speakers yesterday, they were cut off like it was a game show. It was so. I believe while the state I think was less transparent than other states. I think the state is much more transparent than the city of Chicago. So I'm currently, I'm doing this for the Latino Caucus. I'm really only engaging aldermen and kind of organized community groups. We're not really engaging, individuals, and it's just because the Rules Committee just doesn't have an option for that yet, or they're just implementing it. So I think that there's much to be improved for the city process in terms of transparency. Again, I'm not working for the city at large. I'm just doing it for the Latino Caucus. And we made a map. We made a map 3 weeks ago. We got it out there. We gave it to the press, and people are reacting to it. And through communications, through our membership, through our aldermen. And through press, and I check Twitter. I'm adjusting the map as I receive feedback. Where the city, because they just launched a portal and they don't even have a draft yet, they have absolutely no mechanism to receive feedback through the official city map that might be eventually presented.
So fast forward 10 years from now, look into your crystal ball of redistricting and tell me, what does redistricting look like in Illinois and the Chicago City Council? Does it look the same? Does it look different? What would you like to see happen in the next 10 years? And what do you think could happen?
So I think that the likelihood of success by the plaintiffs in the state legislative lawsuit is very high. I think that the judges might make some adjustments to some districts that affected minority representation. And if that is successful, I think that's going to be a very big deal. I think that people are going to remember that 10 years in the future. And so I think that, the state legislative process is going to be more attuned to kind of criticism, so that they might try to make things a little more open, a little more transparent. The city process, it's to be determined. So I'm very hopeful that the aldermen can agree on a map. But if the aldermen cannot agree to a map and a referendum happens, I think that a lot of these aldermen, I don't know what the lesson will be learned. Maybe the lesson is that you want less transparency, so you can just get all the aldermen to agree on a map. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen in the future. But I just think if you look at trends nationwide, average citizens are becoming more involved in the redistricting process. They realize how important this is. So I'm hoping that this will be more accessible to citizens, more transparent. That's what I'm hopeful.
Frank Calabrese, thanks for coming on the CloutCast.
Thank you for having me, Joel. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of the CloutCast. Special thanks to Madeleine Doubek and Frank Calabrese. This episode has been produced and edited by myself, Joel Ebert. The next episode will drop in 2 weeks.